Great leaders don't make excuses, they take ownership. But most people don't start there. When things go wrong, the instinct is to blame circumstances or other people. The best leaders break this cycle and take full responsibility for their actions, choices, and impact. Today, we're talking about how to shift from blame to ownership and why that shift changes everything. Hi, I'm Eric Pfeiffer, and I'm here with Dawn Neldon, and we're excited to jump into today's episode.
Yes, today is all about this idea of how do we take personal responsibility? And as we promised last episode, we have all of these amazing tools that will teach you step by step practically how to implement these things that will change not only your leadership, but also just how you show up in daily life. So I would love to dive into this idea of why is taking personal responsibility so difficult?
That's a great question. My experience, both personally and in working with other leaders for, almost 20 years now, is that personal responsibility is a very scary proposition. And so when we feel threatened as human beings, right, we all have that little almond-sized part of our brain called the amygdala, that when we are in an environment where something feels threatening, whether it should or doesn't, our amygdala fires when it registers something may be threatening. And that could be a text, an email, a conversation with somebody, a difficult bit of news that we found out. It could be the look that somebody gives us that we feel threatened by, we feel unsafe. And the natural human instinct is to want to regain a sense of safety and security. And for us as human beings, we just have this natural propensity to want to blame the world, to want to blame circumstances, to want to blame people rather than taking personal responsibility. I think it's because we think it's actually giving us a sense of control to be able to scapegoat our environment rather than to really own that our being triggered or hijacked, as we're going to talk about here in just a minute, really is our response. It's our responsibility. And so to choose to surrender our need to control our environment or to wait till it accommodates us and to choose personal responsibility, it's a very difficult task, something that I feel like is a muscle that I've been training and building and developing for years now. But I'm going to say this to our listeners. Personal responsibility really is the pathway to the freedom and the power that we're all actually looking for.
It's such an upside down, backwards reality. But when you talk about the amygdala and our nervous system responses, they're all over the internet right now are these memes about how our body doesn't know the difference between a harshly worded email and being chased by a bear.
Yeah.
And it's so true. And so when we get triggered, when those lizard brain responses get triggered, we tend to default into either the victim or the villain. Talk to us a little bit about what do those look like?
Yeah. So, when working with leaders, one of the first things we introduce leaders, teams, and organizations to is this idea that as human beings, we all get triggered. To be human is to get triggered. And a trigger is any experience, big, small, positive, negative, that disrupts us mentally, emotionally, and physically. And for many of us, the older we get, we develop pretty sophisticated coping mechanisms that allow us to push through the difficult experiences and to try and maintain some kind of composure. But as we all know, eventually those coping mechanisms, which are great temporary solutions, don't really carry us too far. And eventually we go from just being triggered to being hijacked. And hijacked is when I say that the amygdala is firing and we're trying to regain some sense of security or control over our environment. And so we fall into one of these two mindsets. One is the victim, one is the villain. The victim mindset is the poor me. I'm going to throw myself a pity party. The world isn't playing fair. Nobody's listening to me. Nobody cares what's going on with me. Right. And so we kind of tend to withdraw from our environment and throw ourselves a pity party. The other mindset is to move into a villain mindset, which is the opposite, where we want to assert ourselves and control the environment around us to make it conform to our expectations or our desires. And the challenge is both the victim and the villain mindset are actually really unhelpful. Because like I said earlier, we think we're gaining control through one of those two responses, but we're actually giving up all of our control. Because the whole journey toward personal responsibility is recognizing I can't really control anything in the world around me. I have control over one thing, and that is my attitude and my behavior. Now, what we also tell people is, gosh, if we can't recover once we're on this kind of hijacked trajectory, we eventually find ourselves pinballing, which is exactly what it sounds like. And we're like that pinball in the machine, just bouncing around off all these different triggers, desperately trying to keep ourselves and our relationships out of the gutter at the bottom of the game. So the whole game we're playing here is not beating ourselves, condemning ourselves for the fact that we get triggered or hijacked, that we might become susceptible to the victim or villain mindset, because that's part of what it means to be human. It's learning to recognize that's not the only option. There is an alternative pathway that when we get triggered, if we can recognize there is this other pathway called the pathway of personal responsibility. And this pathway of personal responsibility is a little bit like that medicine your mama gave you when you were a kid, right? It just tastes, I don't care what it said on the cover, grape flavored, orange flavored, cherry flavored. It all tasted incredibly terrible.
It does.
But why did our mom make us take that medicine? Because they believed that medicine, once it got into our bodies, would actually help us, would alleviate symptoms, might actually help us in our recovery. In the same way, taking personal responsibility is a willingness to surrender and to let go of our desire to be in control of anything around us. Right? We have influence and impact in our environment. We can't control our environment. And therefore, personal responsibility is a surrendering to the fact that I can only control my attitudes, my behaviors, my responses. And here's the beautiful thing. When we choose personal responsibility, number one, we take back our true human power. Because the greatest power we have is to choose our attitudes and behaviors, our responses. And where that pathway takes us is to an incredible experience of freedom, a freedom from needing to blame the world, to feel imprisoned by the world. I tell people, man, when we're pinballing and we're just stuck in that space, it's like sitting in this internal prison and upset at the world for not letting us out when all the while the key is in our pocket. And we get to choose when we let ourselves out. And so much of our journey with leaders is equipping them with the ability to recognize when they're triggered and hijacked, to recognize whether they're operating out of that victim or villain mindset, and then to recognize in any given moment, I actually have the keys to my own freedom. And when we choose personal responsibility, not only do we experience freedom to be in control of our own lives, but we actually begin to experience the benefits of increased composure, clarity, confidence, all of the qualities that we want to operate, that we know will lead to great decisions and responses, not only for ourselves, but for the people that we're influencing. But it actually contributes toward creating an environment or a culture where other people begin to say, wow, I can choose that as well.
It really is the 80-20 hack of leadership, of how we show up, right? Because for those of you who aren't familiar, the 80-20 rule says that 20% of anything in a given system is actually responsible for about 80% of the outcome. And oftentimes in this scenario, we spend 80% of our energy trying to control the environment, other people, the situation around us, when in fact, it's that 20%. It's if we can learn to control our own responses, if we can decide that we aren't a victim or at the mercy of things that are going on around us, we actually get to experience freedom.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, because this is a nice idea.
That's right.
But have you seen this play out in real time for real leaders facing real triggers?
Yeah. The good news is I've experienced this hundreds, if not thousands of times in my own journey as I've learned to take the path of personal responsibility. But I've also seen it hundreds and thousands of times, probably with our clients. About a year and a half ago, we started working with a new client, a large kind of raw commodities distributor here in the US. And within the first few weeks of working with the team, their executive team, I introduced them to this, what we call the pathway of personal responsibility diagram, and talked about the concepts of getting triggered and hijacked and what happens to us, what are our default mindsets. And it gave them exercises to process, like how do they respond and what's at stake and what happens when we stay on that pathway of being hijacked and pinballing versus taking the pathway of personal responsibility. What was amazing was a week or two after, we get to do a coaching call with the executive team. And before I could even jump in, the president's like, Eric, I've got something to share. I'm like, oh, what's going on? He's really excited. I'm going to tell you this story. Like, I'm so excited. I said, what's going on? He said, about a week ago, somebody on our team accidentally sent an email to all of our vendors that also included all of our internal pricing structures, which is a massive error, a genuine mistake. But when that was alerted to the executive team, they called an emergency meeting. And he said, as soon as all of them jumped into the same room, it was immediately finger pointing, blaming, projecting responsibility, throwing people under the bus, looking for a scapegoat. Right? We need to send out an apology and fire this person immediately and make an example of them for our vendors and for the rest of our internal team. And he said it took a few minutes before he recognized what was happening. They were all not just triggered, but hijacked. And they were all playing victim or villain mindset. And he just paused there and he said, everybody, hold on. We just learned a week or so ago that this is the pathway we traditionally go on when things are difficult, when we run up against challenges. He said, instead, what if we took some time right now to practice what we learned from MPWR Coaching? And so he said, instead of us playing the victim or villain, instead of us staying on that hijack path, what if we all just took 30 seconds to think to ourselves, what would it look like for me to take 100% personal responsibility for my part in this experience? Gave them 30 seconds. Then he went all the way around the room asking them, what does that look like for you? And then that person would share. Totally different attitude, totally different tune. He said, by the time they were all done sharing, he said, not only had the atmosphere in the room radically transformed, not only were they now working together rather than against each other, he said, creative solutions just immediately emerged as people were sharing, because they were now more interested in solving a problem together rather than scapegoating one another.
Right.
Rather than protecting themselves, they were actually looking out for the best interest of one another. And that actually led to an incredible solution that cost them almost nothing, just taking a few minutes to ask, what would it look like if we all took 100% personal responsibility in this moment? And those are the kinds of stories, Dawn, you know this working with our client. These are the kinds of stories that we see all the time. And not only do they experience these kinds of breakthroughs in their workplace, but then we get to start hearing stories of how they're practicing this in their marriages, with
Yeah.
with
Yes.
their extended family members, with their neighbors.
Yeah. And the beauty of the pathway of personal responsibility and implementing it on your team is that when everybody chooses to take their own personal responsibility, it means I get to not take responsibility for somebody else's role in this process.
Yeah.
Them taking responsibility alleviates that for me. But even if they don't take responsibility, I still am free to look at the situation and take only my share.
That's right.
Take my share of the responsibility.
That's right. Yeah. Because we're not looking for us to take on everybody else's responsibility. That's a common question that we get.
Right.
Like, do I shoulder the responsibility for everybody? No. We take our responsibility, but by staying focused on ourselves, that's where our freedom comes from. We can't make somebody else choose that path that leads to freedom,
right.
but we can choose it and stay on that path that leads to freedom.
That's right. I want to leave people with a practical step that they could take.
Oh, okay.
What's one thing that we could do this week to
One practical thing to move from good ideas to boots on the ground. How do we do? I'm going to encourage our listeners to take 7 days, and every single day and take 15 to 20 minutes to journal, which I know for a lot of our men out there, male listeners, they might say, are you kidding me? I don't journal, and this feels like I'm writing in a diary. But I'll tell you what, it's one of the most powerful disciplines we can develop as a leader, because journaling is the activity of practicing self-awareness through self-reflection. And here's what I simply to encourage them to do. Just in your journal, just write down, what were the top 2 or 3 experiences that were most triggering for me today?
Mhm.
And how did I feel in the midst of being triggered? Next question, did I get hijacked? Did I move into a victim or villain mindset? And practically, what did that look like? Because the victim and villain mindset can be expressed in a lot of different ways to different people and different personalities. But which one did I gravitate toward, and how did that get expressed? Now, here's another question. We're just going to take this deeper. The next question, how can I imagine that having impacted the environment, the other party or parties that were involved in that situation, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, all the way to even asking the question, like, when I came home from work today, did I bring that home with me? Because am
Yeah.
I still operating out of the victim or villain mindset,
Mhm.
right? And how's that impacting my family? And then here's a simple question. What would it look like if I took 100% personal responsibility for my attitudes, my behaviors, and my responses? And here's the amazing thing, Don, when we slow down and we can get away from the immediate intensity or the emotions of what we've experienced, it's very rare that our listeners, when they really reflect on that question, aren't going to come up with some brilliant answer. When we simply ask ourselves, what would it look like for me to take 100% personal responsibility? What's within my control? What can I actually do about this? What would it look like for me to be an asset, not a liability? What would it look like for me to serve my environment, to look out for the best interest of all parties involved, rather than just trying to save my own neck? And if we would just do that on a daily basis, I can promise our listeners they would begin to see radical personal transformation within just a few short days.
Without a doubt. And the beauty of this tool and what you're challenging them to, Eric, is that if they actually took that time to write down what they were triggered by and what that felt and looked like for them, they're going to start to see some really calm and peaceful. And then you get to hack your own system when
Right.
you realize that you are being triggered and you feel that tightness in the chest. Or for me, my teeth get cold.
What? I've never heard that before.
That's how I describe it, but like the back of my teeth like start to hurt when I get triggered and I start to feel anxiety. And as soon as I feel that, that is the indicator for me of, oh,
Wow.
okay, I need to pause. I need to look at what's going on. What just happened that caused that response? And what do I need to do as a result? It's a game changer.
Yeah. And let me just add something really quick. I think what you just said is so important. I want our listeners to hear this, that the discipline of journaling or practicing self-reflection and self-awareness is just simply becoming more aware of how we respond in moments when we probably are unaware, because we all have blind spots. And so just by becoming more aware, you said hack, but this is part of the way we upgrade our operating system, is that we realize, gosh, I've been running this old program in the past where I get angry and I lose my cool and I yell at people, or I become really aggressive, or I become passive aggressive and I turn to sarcasm and biting comments and, kind of inappropriate joking, or I become passive and I just withdraw from any situation. But that is the process by which we make these upgrades. Now, here's just one last little part I want to make sure our listeners hear. Most people, when we're first learning this, don't realize where they are on either pathway until they're far enough down the hijacked pathway.
That's right.
And what I want to encourage our listeners is that's okay, because the beginning of personal responsibility is just simply recognizing when we are on that trajectory, when we're hijacked, when we're defaulting to negative attitudes and behaviors. And then from that point, to remember that it's our choice. It's in our power to choose personal responsibility. And that choice is what we call our leadership recovery rate. Just like when I was an athlete in my younger years, that we're talking a lot of years ago, our coaches would make us do endless wind sprints, which I thought were ridiculous. And I asked my coach one day, why don't we do all these sprints? Why don't we just run while we're playing? I played soccer. And I thought, why don't we just get our running in while we're
Running while we're playing the game.
Yeah, why are we just running 100-yard sprints every 30 seconds? This feels ridiculous. And he said, because at the end of the game, when everybody's tired, especially the opposition, I need your recovery rate to be such that you can catch your breath and do another sprint when that person is lagging. And that became for me this powerful analogy for me as a leader. I want to be the kind of leader that under increasing pressure, right? When everybody else is kind of folding under that pressure, everybody else is kind of defaulting to these negative attitudes and behaviors, that I still have the stamina and the endurance to be able to bring the best version of me to that situation. And that's what we call the leadership recovery rate. And the more we practice what we're talking about here today, it increases our recovery rate. So it takes us less time to recover from difficult
Yep,
triggers so that we can get back to playing our best game.
that's right. And I want to not forget to mention this. All of these tools that we're describing here are very visual tools. And so I want to direct all of our listeners to the notes for this episode, because we're going to drop in there the tool that you can download with some of those questions that Eric just brought up for you to really make this a practical way that you can dig in and learn how to upgrade your leadership operating system. We also, in the show notes, we're going to have our mini course that's available to you for free. It's 5 shifts to become the leader that you wish you had. And that is available to all of our listeners. Head to the show notes and you will see links to get access to those 2 documents, which are going to be incredibly helpful to you in this process. Next episode, Eric, we are going to be looking at emotional intelligence and why it is a leadership superpower.
Love it. Can't wait.
So we'll see you guys next time.